Before we get into the topic for this lecture, which is sentence variety and sentence combining, I want to just quickly review what we covered in the last lecture, which is the four types of sentences in the English language. So here I have a synopsis of the last lecture in a table. So we have sentence type simple. What that means is a simple sentence has one and only one independent clause and no dependent clauses. If we have a compound sentence, that's basically two or more simple sentences put together, or two or more independent clauses put together. And again, we have no dependent clause. A complex sentence is one that has one and only one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. And then finally, the most refined or complicated sentence in the English language is a compound complex sentence in which we have both two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. Now, what we'll look at is why we have these different sentence types and how important they are when it comes to writing. One of the things that we want to do when we're writing is to vary our sentence types so that we create a more interesting essay or paper or creative work. So if we were to write an essay, for example, in which every sentence was subject, verb, object in that order, the essay would become rather boring very quickly. So good writing varies the sentence style, the types, and the length. Some sentences are short, some sentences are longer. So, for example, if we want to vary the sentence length, we would use a combination of simple and compound sentences. But if compound and simple sentences are used alone, they become very repetitive. The writing sounds choppy where we have subject, verb, object, which is the normal word order for a simple or compound sentence. So we also want to mix simple and compound sentences with complex and compound complex sentences. That way we can vary the sentence style because complex and compound complex sentences add subordination, they add introductory phrases and clauses, and they can therefore make the sentences or the reading more interesting. So one of the things you consider is that simple sentences are short, they tend to be attention grabbers, and then we have longer compound or complex sentences that add a higher stylistic value to our essay or our paragraph. Working with sentence variety is to some degree an art rather than a skill, in that you have to listen to how a sentence sounds and how a paragraph sounds. So I want to look at an example on page 131 of your book. And even if you don't have your book open right now, just listen to the sentence flow as I'm reading the paragraph out loud, and you'll, I think, hear immediately what I'm talking about. Denise wanted to buy a 1978 Volkswagen convertible. She knew it was a classic. She was not sure she could afford the price the owner asked. $7,000 seemed like too much. She considered offering $6,000. She really thought $5,000 or $5,500 was more reasonable. She knew the car had to be hers. She test drove it and offered $5,300. There was some negotiation. Denise and the owner settled on a price of $6,000. The owner wanted more. Denise felt it was too much. But now Denise is the proud owner. If you notice the cadence of that paragraph, it's very choppy. And the reason that it's very choppy is that almost every single sentence in that paragraph is a simple sentence. There is no sentence variety whatsoever, so it sounds like boom, 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 subject, verb, object. And that is something that you need to be aware of when you're writing. You want to vary your sentences so that there's a nice flow to the sentences and it sounds much better, especially when it's read aloud. So let's look at the revision in the textbook on page 131, and I think you'll hear immediately what I'm talking about. Although Denise knew the 1978 Volkswagen convertible was a classic, she was not sure she could afford the price asked by the owner. Thinking $7,000 was too much, she considered offering $6,000. In her mind, she felt $5,000 or $5,500 was a more reasonable price, but in her heart she knew the car had to be hers. She test drove it and offered $5,300. After some negotiation, Denise and the owner settled on the purchase of $6,000. The owner felt she should have gotten more, and Denise felt that she had paid too much. However, Denise is now the proud owner of a classic automobile. In that revision, you see that there's now a mix of simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. So the flow sounds so much better, and it sounds like a natural, well written, high stylistic paragraph. Page 132 of your textbook has a few writer's tips that I also wanted to cover that show that it's not just about varying sentence type. There are other techniques that we can use to improve our sentences. So the first example that's given here is to begin sentences with participial phrases. That's an excellent way of avoiding monotony. So, for example, we have a sentence: Stenton loves Cheryl deeply, and he promised to her, he proposed to her, sorry, and he proposed to her last Friday night. That's a compound sentence. But how can we make it better? We can use an introductory participial phrase. Loving Cheryl deeply, Stenson proposed to her last Friday night. The information is exactly the same, but the sentence is rewritten to avoid that monotony of a compound sentence. Another example would be to use introductory adverbial clauses. For example, the championship game was canceled because of rain. Everybody stayed in the dorm. The two sentences don't even seem to belong together. They're disconnected. I mean, we could make an example here and make it even more disconnected. The championship game was canceled because of rain. We ordered pizza. And you said, what do the two have to do with each other? Or what does the championship game have to do with people staying back in the dormitory? Well, if you use an introductory adverbial phrases, then suddenly the two ideas get connected. We understand now why the author put those two sentences together, right? So, for example, since the championship game was canceled due to rain, everyone stayed in the dorm. Or since the championship game was canceled due to rain and we had nothing better to do, we ordered pizza, something like that. So when you can add an adverbial phrase or any kind of introductory phrase like that, we shorten a sentence and we add more interest to the sentence. The best way to grasp this topic is to actually do some practice. And your textbook on page 133 has an editing practice 5.5, that gives you the opportunity to take some compound sentences and rewrite them to begin with an introductory participial phrase or an introductory adverb phrase. So the example here in the book, the draftsman worked on the plans all week, but he couldn't get them right. Compound sentence. Can turn that into a complex sentence. Although he worked on the plans all week, the draftsman could not get them right. Sounds better flow. So let me just get you started on the first sentence, and then the rest you might want to try by yourself. Angel is excited, semicolon. She sent her first email today. Now, how might you make that into a complex sentence? I would do something such as, Angel is excited because she sent her first email today. We've taken a compound sentence, we've turned it into a complex sentence. Stylistically, it has a higher value. The key to sentence combining is learning how to subordinate ideas to avoid the choppiness of the subject-verb-object model that simple and compound sentences produce. So we have many different reasons that we might want to combine sentences. One reason would be to use coordination and subordination to combine groups of simple sentences into longer sentences. Another benefit of combining sentences is that we can omit repeated words. And also, probably the most important reason for combining sentences is that we can, in a combined sentence, we can establish clearer relationships between ideas that perhaps weren't so clear in separate sentences. And finally, another reason to vary sentences, combining them and so on, is to make the sentence structure of a paragraph more interesting to the reader. Of course, while subordination is a good thing for the most part when writing paragraphs or sentences, it's not a good thing if it's too much. So avoid excessive subordination. Here's an actual sentence written by a student in a writing class, and I'll read it out loud and you'll see how excessive it is. My belief, methods, and objectives as a teacher, albeit being a teacher only in my imagination, come from personal experiences I have observed teaching through the years, and as I think that the teaching learning scenario should operate, which would probably include adequate methods and objectives for the slow as well as the fast learner, which would also involve teacher-student interaction as well as interaction among the students themselves, thereby facilitating the instructor's teaching learning objectives and goals. As you can see, there are way too many subordinations here. Probably the best sentence would have been to end with a period after, as I think that the teaching learning scenario should operate, and then continue with new sentences for the rest of the subordinate clauses that follow. Learning how to combine sentences requires a bit of practice. So I'd like to go over a few exercises with you, and then after that you may want to continue doing those exercises. So let's look at editing practice 5-6 on page 137. In the example, you see we have a series of choppy sentences or simple sentences. Amy hated science. She had to complete 2 courses for her degree. One choice was physics, one was biology, one was chemistry. She finally decided on physics. I think we can all agree that that sounds very choppy. So look at the solution that the textbook author has given us. Although Amy hated science, she had to complete 2 courses for her degree, so she finally chose physics over biology and chemistry. This sentence, the main idea is she had to complete 2 courses for her degree. The fact that she hated science is a subordinate idea. It's not as important. So the author put that concept into a subordinate clause, and the author rewrote the sentence so that the repetition of one choice was physics, one was biology, one was chemistry. That we didn't have that repeating, nor did we have physics repeating, so that the sentence has omitted quite a number of repeated words, and it does sound much better. All right, so let's look at the first sentence, and we'll do this one together. Brad loves winter. He likes to snowboard. He likes to ski. He likes to ice skate. He likes to sled. He wishes that winter would never end. All right, what's the main idea here? The main idea is that Brad loves winter. So we want to keep that as the main clause. So how do we subordinate the rest of the sentence? Well, we don't really have to because, well, we can simply, okay, we'll just say Brad loves winter because he likes to snowboard, ski, ice skate, and sled. That keeps those ideas, but takes out the repetition of he likes, he likes, he likes, he likes. Personally, I would change it even more. I find the infinitive clause here as a bit awkward. So I would use the gerund form, the present participle as a noun. So Brad loves winter because he likes snowboarding, skiing, ice skating, and sledding. I just think that sounds better. But anyway, the concept's still the same. And then we have to deal with the last sentence, which I would put in as a compound. So we'd say Brad loves winter because he likes snowboarding, skiing, ice skating, and sledding. So he wishes that winter would never end. That would be my solution to that sentence combining. Now let's look at the next one. Christy likes alternative rock and contemporary rock bands. Her favorites include Creed, Nickelback, and Three Doors Down. She listens to her favorite CDs all day long. Now there's no one way to do everything, but I would probably keep Christie likes alternative rock and contemporary rock bands as the primary idea, and then just rewrite the sentence to include the rest of the information through subordination. So, Christie likes alternative rock and contemporary rock bands, including her favorites Creed, Nickelback, and Three Doors Down, which she listens to all day. And that's probably what I would write. Of course, you could rewrite it other ways as well, but that's up to you. Anyway, I would suggest that if you have trouble with sentence combining, that you go through the rest of these exercises, and of course, you can look at editing tests 5B on page 144 and 5C on page 146 for additional opportunities to practice. And if you are having trouble with this, of course, you can always come ask me for help, or you can send them to me and ask me to comment on them, and I'll gladly help you go through these exercises because they are independent. There's not any set answer, so it's up to you what you decide is the most important idea and how you restructure the sentence around that central idea.